Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for our Corticon 5.6 webinar. I'm Susan Kudalakis, your host for today. So what I'd like to do is take a minute and introduce you to Mike Parish. Mike has been working with business rules for over 30 years. He currently supports Corticon, but has worked with other rules engines on the sales support side and as a customer building real applications. A little known fact about Mike, when he's not writing business rules, you may find him dancing Argentine tango in Buenos Aires or perhaps fencing. Mike, thank you for your time today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. We're going to go through some exciting enhancements to Corticon. We've only got a limited time this morning, so I'm going to pick some of the more interesting highlights. But when you download the software, you'll get a full document that describes all of the features. You can see there's quite a long list of goodies. Let's start with natural language. This is a feature we've had for a while, and it enables you to write more English-like expressions that explain the technical content of a Corticon rule sheet. But this requires that before you can write those natural language statements, that you have the expression language already in the rule sheet. And this is what the natural language would look like. Now, going forward into 5.6, we've made it possible for you to write those natural language expressions up front. This means that a business person can start the process of rule capture in plain English, even before a vocabulary has been defined. We've also extended the natural language feature to the filters, and sometimes the filters can be quite complex. So the ability to be able to describe in natural language the function of a filter is really quite valuable. After you've created that natural language form, then, of course, at some point, somebody has to add the implementation layer. And the implementation layer could be quite technical. So you can see in the examples I've highlighted here that what a business user might describe in just a few words may end up being quite a complex expression in the implementation. Perhaps the most significant feature is the change we've made to the extension architecture. For those of you that haven't encountered the extensions, let me just briefly describe them. Basically, this gives you a mechanism for creating your own operators. You can also create service callouts, which essentially gives you the ability to create a step in your rule flow that can call an external Java program. So let's look at the current approach first so that you can see how wonderful the new approach is. In the current approach, you create a rule sheet and you simply drag an operator into the conditions. Now, those operators are pulled from a space in the operator library called extended operators. How do they get there? Well, you have to write a Java program. And those Java programs that implement those operators need to be compiled. They're compiled into a file that looks like this. In order to get that executing on the server, moving the rule model is very easy. You've all done that probably 100 times. The definition of the extended operators also needs to be moved into the server, and that goes into a file, into a folder called plugins. The problem with the current approach is that in order to move those plugins into the server, you have to restart the server. It also means that that plugin jar file can get very large because it basically has to have all the operators used by all of the decision services in your server. So how does 5.6 change this? Now in 5.6, you can create extensions that are project specific. Basically, you'll have a menu item that enables you to copy in the appropriate jar files that represent the operators for individual decision services. And what that means is that you now can create your own headings for your operators. You're not constrained to use the extended operator heading that was in the original system. You can create your own categories of operators. Now, you still have the original operators. You can see them down towards the bottom, the extended operators. But the power of this is now each decision service that you deploy carries with it its own extensions. And the beauty of that solution is that you no longer need to restart the server to move those decision services into production. Now, you can still use the old jar file, and typically you would use that for extended operators and extensions that are used for every single decision service that are kind of global. But if you want to set up a specific set of extensions for an individual decision service, you can now do that. So that's very, very powerful. And for those of you a little more technically minded, here's just a quick look at how you set up those categories. In the Java code that you write that implements those extensions, you now make use of the Java annotations, and those names are what will appear in your operator tab in Studio. So you can name them anything you want. And you can even, you can see in the middle of the screen here, you can even define foreign language translations of your operator names and descriptions. Next topic is impact analysis. This is something that customers have asked for a long time. We have some built-in impact analysis tools today, but we've extended that functionality quite significantly. Let's take a look, first of all, at searching for attributes. One of the questions customers quite often ask is, well, how can I trace the impact of an attribute? If I'm going to change age, for example, how can I find all the places where age is used? Well, in the current system, you can use the file search that's built into Eclipse, and that works very well. The problem, of course, is that it finds every occurrence of the name that you search for, including things that may be in comment fields. So it's a little unmanageable. Going forward, we now allow you to select an attribute in the vocabulary, and you'll see there's a little drop down which enables you to find all references to that attribute throughout your project. And the search results will come up looking a little bit like this. So not only can you see the rule sheets and the rule flows and the test cases where that attribute is used, you even get a little summary of the action or the scope where it's used. And if you want to go into the actual rule sheet, you just simply click on the items in this list, and it'll take you directly to that rule sheet. Okay, attribute dependency. Now we're looking at asking the question, how do all these attributes interact with each other? And we've got a new item here which enables you to draw a dependency graph of all the attributes that are represented in a rule flow. Now, of course, a rule flow can get quite complex, and when you draw that picture, it can get quite large. So we also have the ability to filter that. The attribute button that you see on the screen enables you to bring up this dialog, which lets you choose which attributes you want to have analyzed. And then when you perform the analysis, you'll get a diagram that's typically a lot smaller and only shows those attributes and their interaction with rule sheets that you've asked for. Second aspect is rule sheet dependency. Now, we've always had the ability to do rule dependency within a rule sheet. I'm sure most of you have used this function. There are two options. There's an execution sequence diagram and a logical dependency diagram. And those operate on the content of a single rule sheet. And they produce a diagram, something like this. They can get quite complicated too. The problem with prior to 5.6 is that when you have a lot of rule sheets, and some of our customers have hundreds, possibly even thousands of rule sheets, the question then becomes, well, how do I know what's the correct order of execution of these rule sheets? In the absence of the new features that I'm going to show you, one would have to go through each rule sheet and look at the conditions that are going into a rule sheet and the actions that are coming out of the rule sheet, and then kind of match them up so that you make sure the right rule sheets are done in the right order. Well, that can be quite a challenge. So in 5.6, we now are able to produce a logical dependency graph across a set of rule sheets. So here's a picture of the dependency graph that we've produced from those rule sheets that I showed earlier. And the important thing here is it shows how one is dependent on the other. And in this diagram, you can see the very top bubble has no lines coming into it. So that means it has to be the first rule sheet we execute. It has no dependencies. The bottom rule sheet has nothing coming out of it, and therefore must be the last rule sheet. And the ones in between have to be arranged in that sort of order. So what you can do, once you've produced this little diagram, you can go back to your rule flow diagram and you can draw in the connecting lines between the rule sheets. Now, you have the freedom when you create your own rule flow to draw the lines in any order you wish, as long as it conforms to the dependency shown in the diagram on the right. And you can see in the example on the screen, I've actually chosen to group some of the rule sheets because they're related. Deployment support. Everything we looked at so far has been about the rule modeling. Now, the other side of the coin is what do you do with the rules when you've done? And that's deploy them to a server. And we've made significant enhancements there too. Let's take a more concrete example. Let's look at the room where I'm working right now, which effectively is my enterprise. I have inside my firewall my laptop and some other machines. On that other machine, I have several instances of Corticon. I have the standard default access, and then I've also got 3 other instances that represent a development environment, a test, and a production environment. And then on my laptop, I also have the default access. And then I also, up in the cloud, have several other instances of Corticon. So in all, I've got like 6 or 8 different instances of Corticon servers, all of which that have different rule models in different states. So the question then becomes, how do you manage all of this? Well, let's just take a quick review of how it's done prior to 5.6. Prior to 5.6, we would use the old server console, and we could pop up a list of decision services. And this is very effective, but the problem is that this server console is specific to an individual server. So if I've got 8 servers, I need to go and open up 8 browser windows to see my 8 different servers and all the decision services in them. With 5.6, we now are able to consolidate all of that into one single web console that can manage multiple servers in one go. So let me show you that. When you first start up the new console, it will look like this. And the default display, if you haven't deployed any additional decision services, when you start up the console, will look like this. It will show you 2 things. It'll show you up at the top your servers, and that will be your local host server. And then in the bottom section, it will show any discovered decision services. And by default, when you install Corticon Server, you get 4 samples. And you've probably seen these in your own servers. Now, at this point, you can add more servers to that console. You're not limited to looking at one single server. You can add as many as you want. You can add them actually as individual servers, or you can add them as server groups. So after you've gone through that dialog a few times, thinking about my environment, you may end up now with your server list showing the local server on my laptop, the remote server that's at the side of my room, and 2 more servers that are out in Amazon in the cloud. We can also add what are called server groups. And so here what we're doing is grouping together several different servers and giving them a name so that we can refer to them as a single entity. And basically, you just repeat the process of adding servers to that server group. And when you're done, oh, by the way, we now add the ability to authenticate the users who are allowed to access these servers. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But after you're done, I've now added, you can see these 3 servers, the test server, the development server, and the production server, which are on my other computer. I've added those in as a single group referred to as remote server group. So then when I get back to my main display, you can now see several entries. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are individual servers. And the last one is a group of 3. So in total, I've got 8 servers being monitored by this console. And you can see the total execution column. And by the way, the execution column for that server group is the total executions across all 3 servers that are in that group. Okay, so let's just review how decisions get into the server. Most likely the way you've done your deployment is through the deploy to Corticon server option. And basically what this does is pop you up a menu of your rule flows. You select the one you want, you click on deploy, and that decision service gets pushed directly into the server. There are other ways you can get decisions into the server as well, through the CDD mechanism, through APIs, or through the old server console. The important thing there to note is that this is a one-to-one. You're directing your decision service at a specific server. And if you have a need to deploy your decision service to 3 or 4 other servers, you would need to repeat this process. With 5.6 now, we can use the web console. The web console actually acts as an intermediary between Studio and the server. So the dialog now pops up and allows you to create what's referred to as an application. Think of it as a group of decision services. What you may find in your production environment is there are 3 or 4 or maybe 30 decision services that all really go together and all need to be in sync when you do the deployment. And you can add that set into an application or decision service group and deploy that as a single unit. And so what happens is those decision services now don't go directly into the server, they go into the console. And it's the console that then is responsible for deploying those decision services to a single server or possibly a group of servers. And the assets themselves are not stored in the server, they're stored in the console. So the console could be on a different machine from the server. So once you've deployed some decision services, particularly if you've deployed them in an application group, they'll show up in the console under what are referred to as managed decisions. So there's a distinction between managed decision services and unmanaged. Managed are the ones that go into these application groups. And so you might typically see when you open up managed decision services a list of groups of decisions that you've deployed. The first one there, Corticon role-based integration, if we click on that, it'll open up a little section that shows the individual decision services that are part of that group. And you can see there are 3 of them, labeled L1, 2, and 3. We can drill down to get more details on those that group. And you can see in the top right, this is where we now have the ability to edit that group or delete it if we want to go away, or undeploy. So in this case, undeploy means we pull that group of 3 decision services off of the server that it's deployed on. It still stays in the console, so it's ready to be redeployed back again if necessary. We can also go into edit on that group, and this is where we have the ability now to go in and look at individual decision services and do some configuration, or add them or delete them. And at that point, you'll get a little dialog that enables you to set some characteristics of the individual decision service, for example, the description, or perhaps database access characteristics, or some of these other more advanced features, such as the message style, or the monitored attributes. I'll talk a bit more about monitored attributes in a moment. Now, you'll notice on the screen, down towards the bottom, there's one called parameters local, which doesn't have a green check mark. It has a gray with a little dash in. If we drill down into that application or group of decision services, we can see the component decision services. There are also 3 here, but they're also shown in gray. If we try to click further to explore, what we'll find is we get a message that says this decision service doesn't exist. Well, it's not quite true. It does exist, but it's in the console. It's not yet deployed. And if we go into edit on that, we now have the ability to, you'll see at the top right-hand corner, the edit, delete, deploy button. We now have the ability to deploy that decision service group or application to the server. Basically what that means is the group of 3 is being deployed or undeployed as a group. And there could be 30 or 40 decision services in that group. So it gives you a way of managing a whole set of decision services. Okay, I said I would come back to monitored attributes. We've had monitored attributes for some time. And if you're familiar with the prior to 5.6 mechanism, the way that you would set up a monitored attribute is to go into the screen and type in the name of the attribute. You type in the entity name and then a dot and then the attribute name. This, of course, relied on you remembering the correct spelling, and very often you'd find yourself jumping back and forth between Studio and the server console to get the spelling right. That changes with 5.6. In 5.6, in that tab that handles monitored attributes, you'll find we now have a real convenient drop-down list, which will tell you all the attributes that are in that decision service. It's just a matter now of picking the one you want and adding it to the list. So setting up attributes for monitoring is now very, very easy. It's one of my favorite features, I think. And the diagrams you get are similar to what was in the old version, pie charts. And in order to get the total count, if you hover over any of these pies, it will pop up a little box that tells you the percentage and how many transactions were in that group. We've enhanced the statistics section a little bit now. Not only can you see the data live as it happens, but you'll notice by clicking on the boxes to the top right, you can see different time periods for monitoring and execution statistics. Also from the web console, you can execute tests both in SOAP format, which we were able to do before, and also now in REST with JSON format. So you simply choose a file that contains the appropriate JSON request, and that can be generated from the Studio tester. And you can run the test immediately and get back a response right there in the console. And you can see in this case, the first section here are the rule messages. And then if you scroll down a little bit, then you see the version that was executed, and you also see the business objects and their values. The 5.6 console also keeps track of who changed what. And if you've got a lot of decision services and a lot of servers, it can be very important to know who's changing things. So it keeps this history for you. We've also made some significant changes to reports. We've always had reports, but if you recall, in the prior to 5.6, you had a menu that said report, and you got one report. There was only one option for that report. You could change it, but at any point in time, there was only one report. And for example, the rule flow report might look something like this. Now in 5.6, you still have the report menu item, but now you get this dialog, which allows you to choose a couple of things. You can first of all choose the content of the report, and the drop-down here will display a whole list of different choices. There's several that come with the product, but you can copy and paste and create your own. And these are basically XSLT transform files that go through the rule model and extract the relevant fields that you want to report. The second thing you can do is change the style. So there are style sheets, the CSS sheets. You can copy and paste those and create your own variations. This way you can customize the color and the layout of your reports. Here, for example, is what the rule flow report might look like. Or, for example, a natural language report. There's several built-in alternatives for natural language. This one shows across the row a complete rule. You can see it shows the conditions we're testing and the values. It also has the action, and it also has the rule statement across in one single row. And then if you go down to the bottom, there's rule number 2, and you've got a complete picture. So that's one way we can represent it. We can also represent it more like the rule sheet form, where you have all the conditions at the top, then the actions, and then the rule statements, and then the values are listed down the column there. So you've got both choices. And of course, for the more technically oriented, you may also want to get a report that shows the actual expressions. If you're trying to track down which attribute is used in which rule, then you might need the implementation report as opposed to the natural language report. We've also made some really cool improvements to the testing. Let's first of all talk a little bit about the problem that we have before 5.6. If you're only testing one transaction, it's not a problem, but typically you're passing multiple transactions to Corticon. For example, here we've got something called a grower. Now imagine there's not just one grower, but say 100 grower records being passed into Corticon. You run the test, and Corticon produces the answers over in the output column. But when Corticon tries to compare the actual results from the expected, you can't guarantee that the records are processed in the same order. So it ends up flagging this first grower because it doesn't match the first grower in the expected. But it may match a grower further down in the data. So what we've been looking for is a way in which Corticon can be smarter about matching up the records. And now we have it. What you can do in the expected result is pull down this drop-down and specify a key attribute, a unique field that identifies that particular record. Once you've done that, it'll turn into italics. And if you happen to have a hierarchical structure, in this case, growers have invoices, and invoices have many items, you would need to specify some unique field in each one. And often there's a natural field in each object. In this case, it would be like the invoice number. If you don't have a field already in the record that's convenient, you can just simply add one as long as it's unique. And then when you rerun the test, Corticon will match everything up nicely, and everything should be just fine. The only variations you'll find in the data then will be those differences that are real differences. The last thing I want to talk about very, very briefly is authentication and encryption. We've added that to Corticon. Let's just look at how it is today. Prior to 5.6, we had authentication if you wanted to deploy a decision service. In order to deploy, you needed to specify a user ID and password. But there was no control over who could execute it. In other words, if you knew the URL where the server was located and you knew the decision service name, there's nothing to stop you executing it. Now we have the ability, you can configure the server so that it requires a username and password in order to execute. So that's the first thing, authentication. The second is we can now configure the Corticon server to use HTTPS, which means that you can now have encrypted transactions going back and forth between the two. These are a little technical to set up, but the README and the Corticon documentation goes into a lot of detail on how to set this up. So I've covered what I thought were the most important features, but there's a lot more, and I encourage you to download the trial version, take a look through the README, and try out some of these features. We'll have a little bit of time now if you have any questions.
Okay, Mike, thank you so much. I got a couple questions on chat. I think there's a couple that have come in that we may need to follow up one-on-one. So I've written back to you folks who have asked those questions. But I do have a couple for you. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the chat or the question box. But one question, Mike, is do you see Corticon integrating with other Progress products with this release?
That's a very good question. Yes, absolutely. Role-based is probably the primary candidate. The thing with Corticon, as you all know, Corticon is stateless. In other words, something has to pass it data, it runs the rules, and it passes back the results. So you need something else to manage the data that's being passed. And role-based is a perfect example of something that can do that. What we have now in role-based is a visual mapper that enables you to draw a diagram that maps the attributes in role-based to the attributes in Corticon, so that Corticon can talk, so that role-based can talk directly to Corticon. Prior to 5.6 and the latest version of role-based, one would have had to write a rather complicated set of JavaScript to pick your way through the JSON or XML response. Now it's going to all be done graphically.
Okay. I see one that just came in from the chat window. Are there any updates on inline architecture process or processes?
You mean in the embedded? I think presumably you mean the embedded processing. I think that's pretty much the same. The server jar files that are in the web environment are the same ones that are used in the embedded environment. So I don't think there's any significant changes there.
Okay. I got a couple more that are coming in. What is the standard that this engine is based on, or that Corticon is based on, I should say?
Somebody's asking about JSR 94?
Yes.
Yeah, JSR 94 is a particular convention for calling rules engines. In the Corticon world, because you define a specific vocabulary for the decision service that you're executing, the WSDL that gets generated effectively is the contract. So each decision service essentially has its own personalized contract. I think the idea behind JSR 94 was to make a very generalized interface between rules engines. But in the Corticon environment, every decision service is very, very specific. Okay.
So we still have some time. So I have another question for you, Mike, if you feel up for answering more. So
sure.
For someone that's on a prior version of Corticon, say they're on 4.1, how do they upgrade to 5.6?
4.1, wow, that's old. But it's a perfectly good version. Okay, so you've got a few steps to go through to get from 4.1 up to 5.6. You first of all have to get up to 4.3. And that will require you to probably to contact our support folks to get a copy of the 4.3 version of Corticon. Then you can just simply upgrade your 4-point-run rules to 4.3. Once you have that, now you're in the position to make the transition from 4.3 to 5. Now, there was a very big difference between the 4 versions and the 5 versions, and so you'll need to go through that transition. At each stage, typically you'll do testing. Hopefully, you have expected results and regression tests already in the tester, which you can use, and all of that gets carried over. And once you're up onto the 5 platform, then you should be good.
Okay. Let's go with one more question, and then we'll wrap up for today. Just as a reminder to everybody, we will be posting the presentation on our website and sending out a link to the recording after. But one last question. This is about natural language. So entering the natural language first seems like a good way for a business person to capture rule requirements. Are there any plans to automate the rule import from other sources?
Yes, there are. In fact, we're exploring a number of options. There are other software tools that dedicate themselves to what they call rule capture. Rule Express is one of them, but there are many others. They are powerful tools. They use natural language parsing to try to help a business user formulate sensible rule statements. But they all lack an execution environment. And so the natural question is, well, can't I take one of these rule capture tools and hook it up to a rules engine and just automatically generate rules from the natural language? Well, it sounds great in theory. It's actually quite a tricky task because, as most of you have probably realized, when business users write rule statements, understanding what they really mean is sometimes challenging. However, that being said, we are investigating some avenues there.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us to hear the latest and greatest with Corticon 5.6.
Thank you, everyone.